podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to the Paddock and the Pavilion in this fabulous Ashes summer. On today's show, I will take you back to the first glory days of women's Test cricket when it all began in the 1930s, through the words of my Australian guest, Nick Richardson. If you love history and cricket, even just history, this is the podcast for you. My interview with Nick took place on the 15th of May. Hello, Nick. Thanks for joining me on the Paddock and the Pavilion.
Pleasure to be here, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
How are you? Okay?
Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah.
Well, it's a double Ashes year. Are you excited?
Always excited for the Ashes. And one of the great things about the Ashes this time around is that the women are actually playing their first 5-day test. So that's going to be at Trent Bridge in June. So I think that will add an extra degree of spice to what is always a good contest.
Certainly, yeah. We hopefully then won't. We've had a lot of draws in the women's test. Hopefully, with 5 days, we'll get a result.
Yeah, I think that's the plan. And I know Heather Knight, the English captain's been very keen on advocating for 5 days, and Meg Lanning here in Australia has as well. So I think there's no absence of commitment to the idea, and I think we can optimistically expect a result.
In fairness, the last England-Australia test in Australia was an incredible match.
Ah, yes. And I mean, I think it speaks to how longer format of the contest can actually reveal how closely matched the two teams are, and I think we'll see that again this year as well.
Well, on today's podcast, we're going to focus a lot on the first two test series between England and Australia, and we talked off air about the glory days of the 1930s. But to start with, I just wanted to let listeners know a bit more about Nick Richardson. I know you from the fabulous the Maiden Summer podcast, but what can you tell me about yourself?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't often get that opportunity. Thank you for giving it to me. Look, I'm a journalist, an academic and author and podcaster. After I finished my cadetship on a regional Tasmanian newspaper in Australia, I finished up as a sports reporter, and I freelanced on the 1985 Ashes tour and wrote about the dominance of the English team on that particular tour. And I think it was probably one of Australia's worst sides that we've sent overseas. Nonetheless, I stayed on in England for a couple of years and actually played very badly for Horsham Caledonians Cricket Club in West Sussex. Had a couple of seasons with them before returning to Australia. So I've got a doctorate in sports history from the University of Melbourne. I've written or edited several books, and Maiden Summer, which is about effectively not just the two series that we're going to talk about, but about the history of women's cricket in Australia, was released to coincide with the last Ashes series.
We will sort of talk about some other things apart from those two series, but you mentioned 1985. Touchwood, one of my future guests on this podcast, to talk about his Ashes memories is Richard Ellison. I won't tell him that it was the worst ever Australian touring side.
No, please don't. I think there were a few other candidates for that description, and certainly, a lot of the Australian press and the English press have used that phrase about similar occurrences. I think, Martin Johnson at The Independent said it about the England team that came to Australia in, was it 86, 87? They couldn't bat, they couldn't bowl, and they couldn't field, and they very soon turned that around and finished up. That was Mike Gadding's team. I think they won the Ashes fairly comprehensively.
I wanted to start, Nick, by asking you why the 1930s cricket was so popular.
I think there are a couple of reasons. One of them was in the post First World War period. In particular, there was women during the war found there were things for them to do. There were roles that they could play. They became involved in things that had hitherto not been part of their life, and as a consequence, there was this blossoming of opportunities that included opportunities for physical activity and recreation that had not been present before the war. So there was that element that actually fed through into the post-war period of an engagement with recreation and an engagement with sport that had not been there before the war. So there was the social shifts that the war triggered had their consequences too, and played out in that broader recreational life opportunity. The second thing was that there were, and it was kind of interrelated in its way, was that there were newspapers in particular had become integral to people's lives as a consequence of the war coverage, and there were opportunities within the growth of newspapers for discussions and coverage of women's sport, and there were that came with opportunities for women to write about women's sport. So there was this. So there were opportunities. There was the games, proliferation of games, and there was opportunities within mainstream media coverage for these sports to be covered and read about. So they all fed into this kind of dynamic environment where women's sport in particular suddenly had this, had acquired an audience in ways that it had not had for years. And so it kind of reached a kind of peak interest in the 30s and would perhaps rival the kind of coverage that we see these days.
And from an Australian perspective, was women's cricket played by all classes of society compared to what was happening in England?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction to make. The Australians, and I think it's equally true of men's cricket as well. But certainly in terms of women's cricket in Australia, it had been played at a range of levels. For a lot of Australian women, it was the game they played with their brothers or their dads. And these were backyard games or in the street games. And there was a small component of women who played it at school in Australia, but they were a particular kind of schools. And for most in the public school, the state school system in Australia, as it's called, cricket was not available to very many women. So it was a game that was played recreationally with family or neighbours, whereas in England, I think the opposite was true, that it was very much a middle-class game that was patronised through some schools and some universities, but linked quite explicitly in the early years to women's hockey as well.
And through my own research, the first women's match in England is 1745. It's later than that in Australia.
Yes, it is. Although, as Raf Nicholson points out, there was very little in the Victorian England to support the development of women's cricket. In Australia, the first real game was played in 1874 in one of the former gold mining towns in Victoria, in Bendigo. But once it started in Australia, there were a number of games that soon followed in the next 10 to 15 years in Sydney and in, of all places, Tasmania, where there was signs of actually the first organised women's cricket in Australia, with several teams playing in a small part of southern Tasmania. So there was very much a different historical model emerging between the two countries.
And for listeners, when were national organisations first started?
In the mid-1920s for England, and a little bit later for Australia. But the interesting thing, of course, was it's worthwhile pointing out that Australia wasn't really officially federated until 1901. And there was still very strong state parochial associations for some time. And in fact, the Victorian State Association, which was established in 1905, was a very vigorous association and predated the creation of the National Association some 20-odd years later.
Now, the first Test match began on December the 28th, 1934. But just to go back, who approached who, and how did sort of the sort of beginnings of the thought of playing a Test match between Australia and England begin?
Well, it was kind of one of those, I suppose, serendipitous events, and I think, in a sense, the boldness of the ambition might well strike us these days as being quite remarkable. But back in the day, if we look at the context, I think it's a really interesting moment in time. Because bear in mind, in 1932, 1933, we've had the bitterness and the acrimony and the controversy of the Bodyline series, 32, 33, and Larwood and Bradman and all of that. So there is a heightened sense of animosity, perhaps, and that what had been quite a dignified, competitive environment of the Ashes had suddenly become something a little more sinister and a little more dark, especially for the Australians. So it took, I think, a fair bit of ambition on the leading Australian administrator of the day, Margaret Peden in Sydney, to actually approach English Cricket Association to see if they would be interested in making a tour to Australia. Now, not only was it ambitious in terms of all those other things that were going on, the Australian Women's Cricket Council only had 14 shillings in the bank. So they were not in a particularly financially robust situation to extend that invitation. So for England to accept, it meant that only those who had the financial wherewithal to afford to come to Australia and could afford the time to do so would make up that first touring team. So that was the kind of the context. But once it got underway, it had a great momentum behind it.
You mentioned time. How long did it take the England team to get across to Australia?
Oh, several months, because they were on board ship. But of course, the beauty of that was it actually helped them bond as a group. And I think, as we might discuss, I think that travelling together for a disparate group of individuals was a powerful force that I think set them up for success. And similarly for the Australians going back the other way in several years later.
And how long a tour was it? How many games did the England team play in Australia?
They didn't play very many to begin with, simply because the standard of competition wasn't great. They started with a game against Western Australia in Perth, and that was pretty one-sided. There was a game against Queensland in Brisbane as a precursor to the first test at the Gabba in Brisbane. They played a New South Wales side and a Victorian team, but it was quite different to the structure of the return series when Australia went back in 1937, because the Australian women played 21 games on that tour. So there were fewer games all up, for the English women. But the great thing about it was that the schedule enabled them to peak interest, and the game in WA had really big crowds, and as a consequence, it started to fill the coffers of the Australian Women's Cricket Association, which made the 1937 tour a far more achievable ambition for the women going back the other way.
Going into that first Test match, what can you tell me about the two teams?
So the English team was very settled. As I said, they were kind of they knew each other. They'd practiced on the ship coming out. They had felt that they were seasoned. Betty Archdale, the English captain, was picked in. It was a great selection in many ways, although she'd kind of as captain, because her mother was a suffragette. She kind of understood politics instinctively, and she was in so many ways the right person to be marshalling the English team into this broader political context around the aftermath of Bodyline. She led a really seasoned team. Myrtle McLaglen, who became, I think, probably one of England's finest women cricketers. This was her opportunity to shine. Betty Snowball, her opening partner. They were a far more experienced team than the Australians, who assembled under Margaret Peden captaincy in Brisbane, barely knowing each other, barely having played with each other, and from quite disparate parts of Australia, from Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and the lack of experience at that level and the lack of exposure to long form cricket certainly meant that England entered that first test at Brisbane as the favourites.
You mentioned Betty Archdale. I've been reading a bit about her. She was quite an interesting character. I read that she visited her mother in prison, didn't she, as part of the suffragette movement? She also lobbied the League of Nations on gender equality. She was quite ahead of her time.
She was incredibly ahead of her time, and but I think she went to Holloway Jail to visit her mother when she was a little girl, and one of the interesting things about her mother was that she'd been educated in Scotland, and was delighted that Betty wanted to be educated in Scotland as well, and ultimately it was through that education at St Andrews in Scotland that Betty's love of sport was fostered. So she was an extraordinary character who, without giving away the story's ending too much, finished up migrating to Australia and becoming a principal of one of Sydney's finest girls' school, where she championed the girls' cricket until her retirement. And interestingly too, she became a bit of a media personality, appearing on Australian television chat shows, and at one stage was identified as one of Australia's national living treasures.
And that's an ex-England captain.
Indeed. I think that's a rare endorsement of Betty Archdale.
Moving on to the cricket itself, 3 test matches. The first one in Brisbane, they were 6-ball overs as well.
Yeah, they were. So there was a kind of a negotiation made about whether it would be the 6-ball over or the 8-ball over. And Australians had favoured the 8-ball over, and there was also a discussion about the size of the ball. Anyway, so we went with a slightly smaller ball and the 6-ball over. So they were in those days only 3-day tests. So there wasn't an understanding that the game needed to be any longer than that. And in some ways, though, for most of the Australian women, even 3 days was a bit of a stretch. So England at the Gabba showed fairly comprehensively that they knew how to play a longer form of cricket, and they won that test in pretty fine style.
Yeah, it didn't go well for the Australians in the first innings.
No, they were skittled fairly early, and Myrtle had made a bit of a mess of them. Really, she'd took 7 for not very many, and the Aussies couldn't reach 100, and then Myrtle went out with a bat and made 70 odd, and showed her class, I think, and the Australians rebounded a little in the second innings, but they were too far behind in the end and finished up losing by 9 wickets in the end. So it was a pretty one-sided affair, and then the teams moved to Sydney for the second test.
Crowds though were good.
Crowds were great, and it was several. So the first day there were in Brisbane there were 3,000 to 4,000, and I think by the third day they'd gone up to 5,000. So that's a really significant size crowd, and I think that kind of goes to our first point, Stephen, about the amount of media interest. There was great coverage, and the reporters on the ground were in fact cricketers themselves. Carly Hansen, who was writing for the local Brisbane paper, the Courier Mail, did play for Queensland women's cricket team, and in fact had been part of the team against the tourists in the lead up to the first test, and she was covering the match. She was also a hockey player in the Australian winter, but was a particularly well regarded cricketer, and had an excellent career as a sports journalist at the Brisbane paper. So those crowds were in great shape, and of course by the time we get to Sydney, we've actually now got cameras. The movie tone cameras have turned up to cover the test because there's now such an interest in them, and the footage of the Sydney test just shows the crowds are engaged. They're really up for the contest.
You said the SCG. That's quite significant, and they also played at the MCG. It was a long time. That was I think the third test of the MCG. Is it?
Yes.
It was a long time until they played at Lord's.
Well, that's the thing, and one of the England players kind of reflected on how what a privilege they felt to have been given access to the MCG, because they actually used the same change rooms that the England men's team had used. Hobbs, Sutcliffe, all those great names in the visitors' change rooms at the MCG were available for the English women in that particular series. And Hugh Trumbull, who was the secretary of the Melbourne Cricket Club at the time, and for one of the great Australian Test cricketers of his generation, had no hesitation in allowing the English women to have access to the change rooms, or indeed any other part of the Melbourne cricket ground, which considered itself as the Antipodean equivalent of the MCC. But they were certainly very open to the English women's team having access all areas. It wasn't until 1976 that the Australian and England women actually played at Lord's. So that's 40 years later.
How did the Australians fare in the last 2 tests?
So another bruising defeat in Sydney, but by Melbourne. And I think this is where we start to see that quick learning that comes from exposure to high quality competition. By the third test in Melbourne, we're actually got a draw. So things have started to settle. And I think there's a sense that the Australians are actually now have some of the measure of the English team. And I think what we're seeing in that third test, the discovery of an Australian cricketer who became known as the Girl Grimmett, named after the Australian leg spinner Clary Grimmett, and her name was Peggy Antonio, who was a teenager and a leg spinner of some rare skill. And Betty Archdale said afterwards she was praised Peggy's bowling, and she said, we'd never seen anything like Peggy before. She was quite nasty, Betty said, in terms of the movement that she got off the wicket, and it was a significant performance from Peggy. She took six wickets at the MCG, and I think she planted one of those seeds of doubt in among some of the English batters, which took root and flourished because she had a very fine tour of England in 1937.
Do we know how the two teams got on and off the field?
Well, this is one of the interesting things, I think, and it goes to your point that you raised earlier around the backgrounds of each of the teams. And for a couple of the Australian women, Peggy and a couple of her friends, including the all-rounder Nell McClarty, who were from working class backgrounds. Peggy's father was a Chilean dockside worker in Melbourne who died when she was young. Nell McClarty's mother had died when she was a baby, and she was raised by her aunt. They worked in working class roles, and cricket to them was very much a recreation. And they, in interviews subsequently, they remarked on how different they felt to a lot of the middle-class women, not just on the England side, but also from some of the Australian women like Margaret Peden, whose father was a professor of law at the University of Sydney and had been raised through the private school system in Australia. There were clearly some class distinctions, although all of the Australian women got on very well with Betty Archdale, which perhaps tells you why she finished up migrating here.
Yeah, we mustn't forget players are all amateur, aren't they?
They are, and that's the difference. So it becomes very much a case of, the distinctions in the men's game between amateurs and professionals were certainly not the case with the women, and the distinctions were ones more driven by class rather than money.
But the series must have been considered a success because Australia then toured England in 1937.
It was a huge success in a couple of ways. As I said, the Australian Women's Cricket Council had so little financial reserves, but this tour, the English tour, generated more than £300, which was a significant amount back in that day, and it gave the Australian women confidence that they could then go and tour England in 1937. So that was one significant bonus. The second one was that it generated such interest in Australia and had kind of suggested that if this could work for the women as a competition, then surely as the men had the opportunity to tour, then so should the Australian women. So that became a logical outcome of the success of that first tour. And then the third element was one that was actually quite significant, and that was the sense that by the end of that tour, Australian women were competitive with the English team. And that's a really significant element going forward as well, because it means that they feel like that they're not going to be outplayed when they go back to England.
Yeah, talking about going back to England, that the actual trip across must have, like the England team, bonded the Australian players together. And I'm intrigued by listening to the Maiden Summer about the behaviour code for the Australian players on the boat.
Yes, so one of the first things was that they weren't allowed to take husbands. which was perhaps just as, not many of them were. I think only one of them was married at that stage, but nonetheless. So no husbands, no companions, no smoking, no drinking. They were not allowed up to the upper decks after a certain time of day. It was an extraordinarily conservative approach to how they would behave. Because bear in mind, this was still an era when, for single women in particular, chaperones were considered de rigueur. But in this case, the women were expected to not only look after themselves, but behave themselves. So they had to make their own fun, and that fun had to be literally above board in every sense of the phrase.
But when they came to England, where 1937, I think they went to the coronation, and they also went to Downing Street.
They did, and in fact, they met the Prime Minister, whose wife is actually was a cricket umpire, and the coronation was a significant event for them, and they got special seats. They felt, I think, in the end, that the whole experience was an extraordinary insight into another world for them. And for those players like Nell and Peggy, who had come from such hard upbringings, it was an extraordinary experience, one that stayed with them for years.
Yes, it's easy to forget how much we all travel nowadays, how little travel people, certainly working class people, would have done in the 1930s.
It was unheard of. And, if it hadn't have been for the generosity of a range of people, those women would not have been able to take that opportunity. So it was life-changing, I think.
First test in England was played at the county ground in Northampton, starting on the 12th of June. And I was going to mention, in that first test, Eileen Whelan, who became Eileen Ash, who actually was the first woman cricketer to reach a century in age. She was the lady that rang the bell for the 2017 England versus India World Cup final. She played in that first test match.
Ah, right. Okay. I wasn't aware of that connection. Okay. Yeah. Well, you see, although it was at Northampton, there were 5,000 in that first day. So there was, we're seeing a similar level of interest in England to that which we saw in Australia, and that's terrific. And that is the first win the Australian women have so that's their fourth test, and that's their first win. And they win by 31 runs, which is not a lot, but it was a great result.
And a competitive series. Next test at Stanley Park in Blackpool, and the third test at the Oval.
Yes, still a good crowd at the Oval, more than 6,000, and that's a drawn match. So the series is 1-1. So that's probably a really good reflection of where the two teams are in terms of their ability. It marks, I think, a significant increase in the standard of the Australians, but it also says something, I think, about how good the competition is, and the scores. In that series, like that first test at Northampton, Australia makes 300. They make 300 again in Blackpool. So there's actually some batting. The batting is getting better, and the bowling is testing for both batting teams. So I think there's a real sense here that by the end of this series in 1937, we're seeing two teams that are being very well matched, providing some really interesting and absorbing cricket, and that marks, I think, a really great point of of where women's cricket has progressed really quickly. And then, of course, we get the war.
Just going back, do we know that the makeup of the crowds in England, were there lots of women watching the games?
There were some women, but I think there's still a lot of men who are interested in the game, and I think that says something. But of course, the other thing is the coverage in the papers is still largely in the sports pages. So there's also an audience of male readers now as well of women's sport, in addition to women's natural curiosity about what's going on with sport for them.
And our campaigner, Betty Archdale, the England captain, didn't play the first 2 Test matches.
No, she'd been a bit out of form, and they'd handed the captaincy to Molly Hyde, who became a significant player over a number of years. Betty found her way back, I think, into the 3rd Test team, but Betty had also become, I think, had been playing less, and she'd had some injuries as well. So Molly stepped up and became a worthy successor to Betty.
The Paddock and the Pavilion has a fabulous archive of over 200 episodes. On the subject of women's Test cricket, I recently spoke to former England centurion Catherine Leng about her memories of the Ashes. Here's a short clip from episode 204. How different was it playing Test matches against Australia, Catherine, than playing against India and New Zealand?
Yeah, it was completely different. I think I played one home series and one away series. The away series, we actually played at Test venues. So we played at the Gabba, Brisbane and Sydney. But yeah, it was a totally different game, but just competitive. Every ball was competitive. Just maybe because of the England-Australia rivalry, I don't know, but...
The next England tour presumably was cancelled because of the war. What was the effect of the Second World War on women's cricket?
Well, it's an interesting thing because there are similar patterns that observed in the First World War that become, I would argue, more pronounced in World War II because there are more women taking on roles across the board in war-related occupations, but also through the RAFs and the RENs and all of those kinds of things. And there is a sense that those organisations, as part of the way they operate, they provide recreational opportunities. So there's organised sport for a lot of women, either in those munitions factories or other occupations. And of course, over the duration of the war, they find lots of opportunities for recreation amongst themselves. So what happens when the war ends is that there is this, what Ralph Nicholson appropriately calls pent-up demand for sport. So that there is this rush to organise sport in the aftermath of the war. But what's occurred, of course, is that men come back from the war. Some of them are physically debilitated and mentally debilitated. So their physical capacities for engagement in sport are compromised. But in more telling ways, they go back into the roles that women had occupied. So there is now a shift, social shift, and families become priority. And so although there is this drive and desire for sport to resume, as it does, and the first reconvention of the women's contest comes in 1948-49, there is a period that then follows where the regularity of the contest and the quality of the contest is perhaps not as strong as it could have been.
But in the 40s and the 50s, the Test matches, certainly in Australia, they were still playing at major grounds and getting good crowds.
They were, but bear in mind that although there was a 1951 series, there was another 6 years before the next competition took place. So there were lots of things that conspired to prevent that happening on a more regular basis. It fell out of the natural rhythm that had started to be established before the war. And by the time we get to the 60s, there is a sense that the impetus that had been even evident in the late 1940s had started to dissipate and wither because there was so many other things that people were starting to become interested in. And as a result, the crowd started to fall away. The number of women who were interested in playing the game found that there were other things to do. And of course, you know, the 50s was that decade where, in Australia in particular, where there was a kind of a rise in consumerism. There was a determination to embrace suburban life, and a lot of those things that had previously been encouraged around women's sport became supplanted by a more conservative social agenda, which meant that families took priority over recreation at that time.
And all this time when England are playing Australia, they're not playing actually for the Ashes. That didn't start officially until 1998. Can you let listeners know how that happened?
So there was as you say, that it wasn't described as the Ashes until 1998, when the decision was made that something had to be done about this. And in fact, there was a little barbecue, a signed mini bat, and a ball, and in a small but significant ceremony at Lord's, these things were burnt, and a replica or a special kind of trophy that is the women's Ashes was made from that particular ceremony and turned into a trophy that has become the Ashes for women as we know it today. So it was a significant moment because it recognised the separate competition, but it also made the direct connection to the tradition that had distinguished cricket between our two countries for such a long time. So it was a great moment, a significant moment. And although I don't think historically it's fair to refer to those first games back in 1934 as being the first of the women's Ashes, I think we can see them as being the precursors to what then became the women's Ashes, and they are no less valid because they don't carry that name.
And in the 21st century, the women's game has gone from strength to strength. I'm just a list of a few things. 2014, England first. There were some first paid contracts for England women players. The BBL, the WBBL, started in 2015. We had a packed Lords for that World Cup final, England in India in 2017. Then in 2020, just before COVID, we had 86,000 at the MCG for Australia and India in that T20 final. 2021, we had the 100, which is, transformed women's cricket in the UK. And then this year we've had the WPL.
And one of the interesting things about it is that that issuing of the first contracts by the ECB back in 2014 was a really significant moment. But I think that the thing that makes that work is being able to have a high-grade competition that supports women. That was true in Australia with the start of the WBBL, and clearly it's something that's going on, as you identify, with the 100 in the UK. But the other thing now is with the women's IPL, and I think it was the broadcast rights was sold for something like, I think it was £93 million, which meant that the whole franchises were clearly going to be able to afford to pay significant amounts for marquee players, which is what we saw. And you can bet that the standard of women's cricket as a consequence of the next 2 or 3 years of the women's IPL will just climb stratospherically. So I think we've got some good years to look forward to around that, Stephen. What I would say, which I find interesting, is there was a quiz in one of our Australian papers at the weekend, and it said Australian women's cricket captain Meg Lanning has been in the role since 2014. How many test matches has she captained? So that's 9 years captaining an Australian team. She has been captain in 6 test matches. Now, that tells you, I think, about the way that the predominant form of the women's game has been the one-dayer, the 50 over a side, and more recently the T20. And obviously they form part of the Ashes competition for the women. But if you talk to most of the women's players, what they wanted more of are tests. And I think it's one of those great things about those pioneers back in the day was that they were playing test matches. They were considered tests at 3 days each, and that's all they played. And I think that's a really it underlines fairly significantly how important the long form of the game is for both men and women.
Yes, that's a very good point. I mean, Catherine Siver-Brunt, who's just retired, I think she only played 14 tests, I think, in nearly 20 years.
Yeah, and it is something that I think is a bit of a blind spot with the games administrators. But here again, it's also about patronage, and of course, whether it's the 100 in your country or whether it's the WBBL here, it's about audiences and can you get people through the gate for all those days. Anyway, that's something that you and I won't be able to resolve.
But I do notice that in your Australian fixtures that came out, I think, a day or two ago, South Africa, who are one of the women's teams touring Australia this winter, are going to play a test match against the Australian women.
Yeah, which is great news, and I think long overdue. It shouldn't just be about us playing tests against India and England. And I think, this is where the leading countries have to do that responsibility of helping to promote the game elsewhere. And playing a test against South Africa will be a really good thing for South African cricket, as well as certainly bringing a smile to the face of the Aussie girls as well.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I'd recommend anyone to listen to the Maiden Summer podcast. There's 7 episodes. And just to end, your reflections on the glory years of England versus Australia, or Australia versus England Test cricket in the 1930s.
Yes, I think it was a wonderful time. It was a time for the Australian women in particular to find a way to transform their lives by exploring a sport that conventionally was not seen as a game that they could play, and not a game that they could play at that level. But they broke through, they created something, and they established, I think, a platform for all those who came after them in ways that they could never have predicted, but should always be lauded for. So I'd take my hat off to them.
And just thinking, it's not that many years, we might even see centenary test matches perhaps between England and Australia to commemorate those two series that we've talked about today.
Well, I hope I'm still around to see that, Stephen, because I'll be there.
Well, thank you very much for being there on the Paddock and the Pavilion for today's podcast.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Sports Social Podcast Network.